1:15, and so we will work to get started as well. I had an unproductive 30-minute break and I've not eaten my lunch yet, so at times I will turn video off. That is not me not caring, it's me allowing me to eat without you looking at me. I believe that I would turn it to Director Murphy or AAG Minor for sort of recapping what is our next step. We're moving through closing deliberations on 2 through 6 with a list of issues. AAG Minor, do you want to, or Director Murphy, do you want to lead off or show us the screen? There we go. Thank you. Okay, are we now to Rule 423? Is that where we are, Joel?
Mr. Chair, there's another thing on the 303A5 list. I believe Commissioner Nanjapa yesterday mentioned having other aspects of the CIDR database she wished to discuss, and I wasn't sure if that was the question she asked regarding air resources and PFAS, or if there were indeed other things that the commissioners had on the list for 303A5 that have not been deliberated about yet.
All right, open it up. Commissioner Nanjapa or other aspects of CIDR database.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think given the discussion on some of the wildlife related issues, that was another piece. I had some of the same questions that Commissioner Messner had raised. And I think, let's see. Oh, so the other thing is more of a little bit more of a discussion perhaps for us as commissioners, is whether this is something that Commissioner McGowan, I think, raised in previous in our previous deliberation on the 300 series about tying some of the cumulative impacts data to emissions goals. And I know we kind of already talked about that with some of the air quality related things, but I'm also wondering if there's a way to sort of tie this in with some of the other pieces, even within 300 and in the 600 series, with respect to both alternate location analysis and maybe citing conditions of approval. So in other words, additional mitigation measures or reducing kind of overall cumulative impact, of a particular location. So again, this is more of a generalized kind of concept, and I'm just trying to think about if there's a way that we might be able to incorporate that notion into these pieces that tie together, as we think of that sort of bigger picture of how we can encourage some of these practices in a way that overall reduces cumulative impacts.
Sorry, I was muted. Do others want to weigh in on this? That others includes Director Murphy and AAG Minor. Commissioner McGowan.
Chair, yeah, I think that ties into the discussion we've been having about the requirements for us to not just evaluate and collect data, but address. And so, not sure if we should be addressing it here and tying it to kind of the statewide goals for reductions for certain air quality emissions, or if it's more relevant in a different series. And I harken back to my favorite series, the 900 series. And maybe it belongs in there, but I'm definitely interested in making sure that we tie it all together with what's going on from the statewide perspective and the goals that we have as a state and what's happening over with the Air Quality Control Commission.
Sorry, AAG Minor, do you want to respond, or Commissioner Putnam also has unmuted?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, yeah, I think the sense that we had based on the structure of this is that it would be a subject we discuss in the 900 series, as well as the kind of ultimate determination that the commission would be making, for each permit or each action under whether it meets public health, safety, welfare, et cetera, criteria, and that we would work through it in that criteria, in that context. That being said, I think our intent at CDPHE, since we are releasing the state is releasing the greenhouse gas roadmap next week, and we are recommending that the Air Quality Control Commission set targets for emissions and reductions for various sectors, including the oil and gas sector, that we would provide that information to the commission to provide context that will be useful in evaluating this information. And similarly, we go through a regular effort for inventorying and modeling for ozone. And given the results we had this summer, it's clear we need further reductions in emissions for ozone precursors as well. So whether it's methane, the other greenhouse gases, or the ozone precursors, I think from our perspective, we need reductions rather than additions. And so, they should apply, the minimization language that you already have as rigorously as you can so that we can meet our overall state goals.
Commissioner Nanjapa, Commissioner McGowan, follow-up. Commissioner McGowan.
I feel like a little chicken and egg. Commissioner Putnam, when is the commission going to make those decisions about allocating out reductions to various industries or sectors? Sorry.
Commissioner McGowan, it's a great question. So it's currently on the agenda for the AQCC, I believe on the 23rd of October. That being said, the greenhouse gas roadmap will be out for public comment throughout the month of October. And so it may be that they'll decide to act more in the November timeframe or take a different course altogether. I think our recommendation would be, given what we know now, we know enough for them to adopt a resolution, but it'll be up to them. So you're right, there is a chicken and egg question. That being said, I think we can still provide that information to the director and to the commission, this commission, not the Air Commission, so that you have that information to inform particular decisions on the cumulative impacts of any particular application.
Commissioner McGowan.
So I'm a fan of making sure that we're aligned with what our sister agency is doing and doing our part to help meet those emission reduction goals. And so I would like for us to discuss how we can align and put those pieces together, knowing that probably the timing is not going to be perfect and knowing that we're getting pressure from some of the parties to make some decisions about how we're going to tie emissions reductions or cumulative impact to actual reduction goals. And maybe that's something that we can discuss more in the 900 series about what that looks like and how we put those pieces together.
Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. And I think Joel should provide better detail on this, but I think that is one of the spaces that we've reserved in 904, specific to air-related components as compared to like cumulative impacts from wildlife. So AAG Minor, do you want to provide any better detail on that?
AAG Minor.
No additional detail. I think Rule 904 is indeed perhaps a great place to have that discussion.
Commissioner Nanjapa and Commissioner McGowan, if you raise this, are you comfortable with that direction? Great. Seeing shaking heads up and down means yes. AG Minor, are we then moving down the list?
That's right, Mr. Chair. If we're staying within the 300 series, and the next thing on the list is Rule 314E9, which I believe Commissioner Gonzalez raised in the cap.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I don't have any language suggestion for this rule, but there was a lot of discussion, or at least I provided a lot of discussion on my concern about the previously stated 45% threshold, which matches that of DSU's, matches that of pooling requirements, that could set an unrealistic expectation for the ownership level threshold that would be required in these caps. My big concern, as I stated a couple of weeks ago, is that we've seen in the past with the interpretation and application of certain commission rules, that if they do not set forth the appropriate bounds or expectations, that there are plenty of operators out to game the system, to create caps or permits that essentially just hold acreage hostage with no intent to develop or with little intent or ability to develop. And so what I'm getting at here, and I'm kind of talking through this, so I apologize for the ramble here, but what I think I'd like to see is something in the statement of basis and purpose that captures that concern and that really sets the expectation that, at least in my mind, that caps, given their nature to eliminate competition for development and to eliminate the ability of other operators to utilize their property rights within that cap boundary, that we as a commission require substantial ownership and or consent by the other parties within that cap boundary in our evaluation of the cap itself as it comes before us. And almost more importantly, maybe equally as important, is when we as a commission are evaluating or considering the suspension of other permits while a cap is under evaluation. And so I had that concern. I had that concern when I read the rules the first time. I still have that concern a little bit now, even though I appreciate staff having removed that explicit threshold. I think there's plenty of room in the SBP for a more clarity that sets what our intention is and sets the expectation for how we want to see these caps and how we want to create and instill fairness among operators for these caps.
Thank you for those comments. Do other commissioners want to weigh in on this issue, and or Director Murphy? Commissioner McGowan.
Maybe staff could remind me how I realize this is the concept is a bigger geographic area and therefore might affect more mineral owners, but isn't this similar to the rule we have for a normal drilling and spacing unit? No. Yes. 45%.
Which, Chair, may I? Sorry.
Yeah, Director Murphy.
Thanks. The fundamental difference in my mind between the cap and a spacing unit or an OGDP is the operatorship component, in that it designates a single operator. So if operator A and operator B both own minerals in a spacing unit and the lands are spaced, either operator could propose a pad and wells. If it's within a cap, only the operator that sought the cap can propose the surface location and wells. The 45% pooling component does apply equally across them, because 45% applies to any operator or any owner seeking to pool minerals, but that's kind of a slightly separate little category and process, because not every spacing unit needs to be pooled. And I'm going quickly over a lot of really complicated pieces, so tell me to slow down, ask questions. And it always gives me comfort to see Commissioner Gonzalez nodding affirmatively when I talk about this stuff.
So I think I'm going to need you to explain that a little bit more, because I think what I'm struggling with is I feel like there's a lot of whoever is there first going on anyway. So as far as equity and fairness and how this all plays out, I guess I need this explained a little bit more, and whether or not that's Commissioner Gonzalez or Director Murphy, what the concern is and how that's different from how business is being done today. I guess I just need that explained to me a little more. Sorry.
Can you run the question by me one more time?
Commissioner McGowan.
I think I'm trying to understand, maybe from Commissioner Gonzalez, what concept or what root cause issue we're trying to solve, and that the 45%, is that what you're concerned about? The 45% is not a high enough bar, or isn't inclusive enough, or?
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think, I think that the thing with caps and what's really hard to wrap your mind around is separating the effect of a cap versus the effect of an OGDP, separating that out from the difference between a DSU and the difference between a pooled unit, and really understanding how they all play in terms of lineage, in terms of their sequential nature, and in terms of the rights associated with each one of those. When it comes to permitting a well in Colorado, or creating a DSU, or pooling a unit, prior to SB 18181, you could have 0.01%. You could create a DSU that captured someone else's 99.99%. You are then committing their dollars and their acreage and their property rights to your exclusive ability to operate and your exclusive oversight for operational spends, for operational risk, for in interference with any potential other plans that were available for those property rights. And when you do that, you're really holding someone else's property hostage for your own benefit. And so that's allowed, right? In the rules, that's kind of set out that you can do that with a permit, you can do that with a DSU. Now, the DSUs we typically see, I've seen some that are up to 4 or 6 sections, but they're not the scale of 30,000 acres or however big the Noble one was, may have been a lot more than that at the time. And when you think about the CAP and the benefit of having that exclusive operatorship, you are taking that issue, or I won't say it's a problem, it's definitely a problem for some people, but the issue of having operatorship designated to one operator and extrapolating that to a much bigger area where anyone who owns a minority interest in that area will not have any say into the timing, into the operational activities, into the methods that go into developing that area, or into the costs, of which they will likely be saddled with their proportionate share of those costs, assuming they want to consent and participate to receive the benefit of their minerals. So the difference between the pooling and the DSU and the cap is that the cap is so much larger, and it creates this incentive, this exclusivity of operatorship that necessarily eliminates other operators from the ability to enjoy their property rights and to utilize their property rights. And when I think about the 45% pooling threshold, that's kind of the last step along several steps that other parties would have an opportunity to participate in, to object to if needed, to work out negotiations with those other operators on smaller scales. And I think that's less problematic in that instance. But when you extrapolate that out to however many tens of thousands of acres a cap may consume, then you're really eliminating a minority operator or minority owner's ability to enjoy their property rights. And when I say enjoy their property rights, I mean their rights to develop, their rights to monetize, and for mineral owners, their rights to receive those royalties at a pace or at a cost that they feel is the appropriate one based on their interest. I hope I explained that well enough, but I'm happy to answer any specific questions beyond that. And really what I'm getting at is I don't believe the 45% threshold that applies to pooling is appropriate for caps because of the size.
Commissioner Gonzalez, thank you for refining the issue. Are you suggesting that we ought to have some percentage, or are you suggesting that we should just, in the statement of basis and purpose, clarify this point so that as future commissions are using the cap, they are taking into account the concern that you've raised, and that gets into the equation of whether to approve a cap or not?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is the latter. I don't believe there's a number that we can come up with today with our limited experience evaluating caps, evaluating CDPs, and really just evaluating OGDPs and DSUs and pooling applications all together. I don't think we could apply that number today. I had suggested to staff that we remove that ownership component altogether a few weeks ago. That was removed. I've since kind of thought about that a little bit more and thought, man, I don't want to set the expectation that we are going to be approving caps for operators that come in with a minority. I mean, there may be times when they come in with a minority and it may be the right thing to do, but I want to leave it wide open. And I want to, in the statement of basis and purpose, or at least put it here on the record, that as one commissioner myself, that I believe that there should be a substantial hurdle for ownership or consent. When I mean consent, I mean, not necessarily participation, but no objections from other working interest owners and mineral owners within the cap boundary before our approval. Is that clear enough, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, that certainly clarifies it for me. And I think that AAG minor is putting in brackets some suggestion that they can work on during the statement of basis and purpose further development. I guess I would turn to other commissioners. Are folks comfortable with this notion finding its way into the statement of basis and purpose? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, conceptually, I would agree with Commissioner Gonzalez. I think my question is, and this would be to Commissioner Gonzalez or staff, would be, is this bar achievable to get substantial consent, or does this actually enable the utilization of caps?
Every time I mute myself. Commissioner Gonzalez.
I'm going to want staff to back me up on this, because I don't want to be misstating anything. But it's my understanding from the two Noble CDPs and from the PDC or SRC CDP that was submitted, and likely from the Encana or Crestone CDP in Boulder County. I think those are the 4 CDPs that we've seen in the last maybe 18 months or so, that in those, the lowest one that I remember reviewing was an 85% ownership. And that was Noble's Wells Ranch Mustang CDP. I don't recall. It was the first one they did. Anyways, it was 85%. And that's something where you still have 15% of owners and operators who are subject to Noble's whim, or the operator's whim, whoever it might be in the future, for their timing, for their operational efficiencies, for their cost effectiveness in that matter. And I think that maybe that's in the tolerable rate. I don't know. We want to see, we want to hear from the other stakeholders in that regard. But what we've seen so far in CDPs is a substantial ownership level, to that level of about 85 to 90%, which is probably in the range where I'd feel a lot more comfortable than having someone with 45% interest coming in and controlling that much acreage, essentially and potentially to the detriment of the other property owners.
Commissioner Messner, follow up.
No, I'm certainly, I'd be interested in hearing from staff before I follow up. Director
Murphy.
Thank you. And Chair, Commissioner Gonzalez, Commissioner Messner, I would echo Commissioner Gonzalez's comments. I tend to think that when we have seen these large scale developments come before us, yes, it has been with upwards, well, by the time the cap or the CDP came forward meaningfully, the ownership percentage was, I think, generally north of 70%. When it submitted, it might have been less than that, and then trades are worked out through the process, through the deal, through kind of the exploration of whether a hold on the acreage is appropriate while the CDP was pending. Deals end up getting done and people's mineral ownership ends up increasing. I think that leaving flexibility with the ownership is the right thing to do, because this is an innovative industry, and looking at how different owners may come together in different joint ventures or other relationships to put together a package of acreage to be developed comprehensively is a good thing. And I think that tailoring it to the statement of basis and purpose, that the expectation is substantial, but recognizing that there could be an unusual circumstance where maybe when the CDP comes in, they are a minority owner. I think we can work through those things. And so I support the changes that Commissioner Gonzalez advocated for a couple weeks ago. And I think that this gives us the tools and the flexibility to work through when folks come forward with a large scale plan, and it also lets us complement some processes that may be going on at the local government level when you think about large scale operator agreements or other kind of that comprehensive planning tools at the local level. I would like to build something that's complementary to those as well. So.
Thank you for that. And I appreciate that. And I can be in support of this.
And I can be in support of this as well. And I think AAG minor that the relevant language can go into 314A under purpose of comprehensive development plans, so that we can establish that it's not the purpose of comprehensive development plans to approve them in a manner that is creating the concern that Commissioner Gonzalez is raising. Other commissioners supportive of this or have questions of this issue? Great, seeing some thumbs up. Commissioner Messner.
I'm not sure that this actually came up in our initial list, but it was under caps. And I think we had some stakeholders provide testimony regarding the need to provide notice in the cap process within 2,000 feet, particularly because now the utilization of siting within a cap is an off-ramp from our setbacks and siting recommendation 604 rules. Unless I'm missing something there. Am I the only one that has that in their notes, or?
Commissioner Nanjapa.
No, I was just going to agree. I appreciate that Commissioner Messner raised that. That was this issue, because yeah, that was something else that I had as well in my notes, and I think it would be good for us to talk through.
Director Murphy, AG minor, thoughts?
Mr. Chair, I can start, and Director Murphy can perhaps add on. I did scroll down to the notice provision for the cap. I do think that there are some challenges associated with that if the operator is not seeking preliminary siting approval, because otherwise the cap won't necessarily have firm locations contemplated, and thus figuring out which building unit owners and tenants are within 2,000 feet of a proposed location could be a challenge, right, if there aren't proposed locations. So as it's set up, it's all surface owners if there are proposed oil and gas locations, and then sort of mineral owners and local governments, and then there are kind of some other public meeting options, but there isn't sort of that same building unit owner or tenant owner or tenant notice that there would be perhaps through other rules where locations are more firm, though if that is the Commission's direction, it can certainly be added, I'm sure.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And AG minor or Director Murphy, I just wanted to make sure that I was clear on some of these details. I know I asked this before, but so with the cap, there is still an OGDP that comes in that we would review, and would that be subject to the notice, or would the folks that would be sort of affected parties in that case, or I don't know if we would use that term in that instance, would they still be noticed for an OGDP? I'm seeing heads nodding. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. I think maybe that is what the concern was of the parties, unless Commissioner Messner understood that differently, or other commissioners, but that was the part of it that was a little bit unclear, and I wanted to make sure that I understood correctly, that there's still that additional piece of the process that occurs. And yeah, I would appreciate any additional comments from AAG Minor or Director Murphy.
AAG Minor.
Certainly, I can try to answer that, and Director Murphy can also add more as always. That is certainly true. So even with preliminary siting approval, there is still going to be subsequent permit applications to the actual oil and gas locations through an OGDP or and/or Form 2A. And I think it's important to note that as sort of part of recognizing the option of preliminary siting approval, you'll see in the staff red line that there are a few places where there is sort of an exception made for locations that are subject to a cap with preliminary siting approval. And those are essentially the rules related to siting, but not sort of the overall notice and other rules. So, for example, I think really the key place to think about is there won't be an subsequent ALA for those locations because the ALA will have already been conducted as part of the cap, but certainly the normal notice requirements of Rule 303 will still apply.
Commissioner Messner.
So I'm going to ramble here a little bit again, but the off-ramp that could potentially be utilized through a CAP with preliminary siting would enable a site to be located inside the 2,000-foot area without needing to go through 604B4 and that hearing process. And there would still be an ALA as part of the CAP, and there would still be, these other elements, and there would be a hearing for the OGDP or the 2A portion of it. But where in that is that notice, so that if folks inside of within the 2,000 feet would have the opportunity to participate and share their thoughts on that, and have that knowledge of what was happening during the CAP process.
Who wants to take that up?
Chair, I may jump in.
Yes,
And then,
Director Murphy.
Commissioner Messner, I think I appreciate that concern, and I'm wondering if AAG Minor could scroll to the language around the preliminary siting approval that we built within the cap itself, cap language. And so to me, Commissioner Messner, the opportunity to site within 2,000 feet, that exception to Rule 604B only applies if the operator's gone through the preliminary siting process. And so would it then make sense, or would it address your concern, and subject to input from the rest of the commissioners, to require citing notice of the cap? And sorry, AAG Minor, this is going to be a mess for you to unpack legally. But basically, if an operator is pursuing preliminary siting approval, that notice also then needs to go to folks within 2,000 feet of a proposed kind of preliminary location, so that people have notice, they can participate. To me, it's very consistent with what I've seen when CDPs have come forward, in that like all of the people within the CDP generally get notice of like community meetings and what's happening. So I'm not sure it's creating some, I think it's consistent with how we would expect an operator to engage anyway, and how they would be engaging, but it does address to me, the concern, Commissioner Messner, that you've articulated. So food for thought. This is me thinking on the fly, which is always a little bit dangerous.
Commissioner Messner.
I really appreciate that, Director Murphy. And yes, that to me does solve it. And I do appreciate that this would also, I'm chasing a fly here. That this would already be an expectation, but I do think that having that in there is important, particularly in light of the potential to utilize the preliminary siting as an off-ramp. So thank you for that. That would work good for me. I look forward to hearing what other commissioners think.
Do other commissioners have thoughts? Commissioner Nanjapa?
Yeah, I would agree as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that, and thank you, Commissioner Messner and Director Murphy for that dialogue. I think that really helps a lot to for the same concern for me.
Thumbs up. Okay. At the risk of going backward, which I hate to do, but which I'm going to do just a bit about, and Commissioner Gonzalez, this gets back to the point you had raised about mineral ownership and sort of putting that in the statement and basis. I'd like to call on maybe our attorney, AG Davenport. So in putting in this sort of concept of mineral ownership in the statement and basis, I went back and I looked at sort of approval denial, and approval denial of CAP it's pretty broad, and it's sort of, it meets all the criteria, and it's, it doesn't say it, but it's a good idea, and this is a good way to develop minerals or something like that. But the denial doesn't have within it sort of the consideration of mineral ownership or the size of it. And I don't know if we want to go there or not. And Commissioner Gonzalez, I'm hoping to, I hate to sort of reopen this, but I just want to make sure we get it right. And so AAG Davenport, can you provide some perspective on this so that we can make sure that we're getting the policy right here?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I would like to check in on is kind of the commission's intent in regard to mineral ownership in a CAP. Perfectly acceptable and appropriate for a statement of basis and purpose to explain that the director and the commission will examine how much of the minerals or the percentage that an applicant for a CAP may own. However, if the commission's intent is for the amount of mineral ownership to become a determining factor in approval or denial, in other words, to grant the commission with the authority to deny a CAP based on mineral ownership, then I would be more comfortable if that actually appeared in the rule itself. So I think what this will require is sort of checking back in on the intent.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, AG Davenport, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for bringing that up. I think it's really important. We're trying to get to the right spot here, and this is a sticky one, right? It's a new rule. There's lots of ways to think about it. AG Davenport, would we be required to identify what that threshold would be in the rules, or would it be simply adding that as a consideration or potential basis for denial?
AG Davenport.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think if your intent is to grant the commission the ability to deny a CAP based on something, based on a specific, whether it's substantial or an actual percentage of mineral ownership, then that should be in the rule as a called out basis for denial. If you want simply for the director and the commission to be able to consider the percentage of mineral ownership and work that into their consideration of how this CAP should operate, then that's probably appropriate for the statement of basis and purpose. But again, if you would like the ability to say, no, you don't have this percentage of mineral ownership and therefore your CAP is denied, I believe that needs to be in the rule.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, I'd like to clear that up just a second. So let me paint a super dirty and easy scenario. But if some mineral owner came out and they said, hey, I've got a couple square acres or I've got a couple sections here and there, and I really want to be able to develop this entire township. So they draw a box, the entire township wide, 36 square miles. And within that, they've got 2 or 3 sections in there, 2 or 3 square miles. if they come in and they say, hey, we've met all the requirements, we did the notice, we're doing all these things, you're saying that as the rules are currently written, we can't say, hey, you got this other operator over here who owns all these minerals and who is against this cap. We couldn't deny it as the rules are currently written?
In my view, if you want to be able to deny a cap, and I think we should also point out here that a cap is not a drilling and spacing unit, which doesn't have a minimum mineral ownership percentage in it, that I do recommend that you have something in the rule, substantial or an actual number, that would give you the ability to say to an operator or an applicant for a cap, you may have met every other requirement for a cap, but you don't have what we consider to be a substantial enough mineral ownership, and therefore your request for a cap is denied. I think if you would just like for that, the percentage of mineral ownership to be a consideration, there are lots of things that caps require, and many ways that, the development commitments or managing the phasing of development that could potentially take the ownership percentage into account that already exist in the rule, and that there are lots of requirements for caps in the rule already. So it's kind of the difference to me between the ability for you, the commission, to be able to say, you don't have a substantial or some number, and while you may have met everything else in this cap, we're denying it for that sole reason, then I believe it needs to be in the rule. If you want it to be a consideration that could inform, a variety of different things in the cap, as I already said, the phasing or the development commitment, then I think we could work that into the SPP.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Could it generally be tied to correlative rights?
I think that's a possibility that it could be tied to correlative rights. As you well know, Commissioner Gonzalez, there are a host of considerations in correlative rights, and correlative rights are something the commission absolutely could consider. But yeah, that is a possibility. And we could probably work that into the SBP in that way.
And perhaps that's the right landing spot for this. I'm very concerned about putting any kind of number in there. I don't think that any of us are equipped to do that right now. And I'd really like to see how this plays out in real life before we reevaluate it here whenever we do. So I'd be concerned about that. I don't know how it would be framed in the rule to have that as a consideration other than through correlative rights. And I think ownership percentage and one's ability to develop and to exercise on their own property rights is a correlative right. And so if there's a way that we can loop that in, I think that might be the appropriate landing spot. And I think that'd be within our authority to make decisions based on, if I'm not incorrect there.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Gonzalez, can you repeat that last piece, please?
Oh, what I said is that if we make decisions based on correlative rights, I don't think that is outside of our authority as a basis for making determinations.
And I guess my only thought here, and I appreciate the thing that you brought up, and I didn't mean to reopen a door that we'd already closed. I mean, I just, at the end of the day, I want caps to work. I definitely think that it is a good planning tool, and I don't want this to sort of become yet another bar towards success of cap. And so I guess I sort of swing to tucking it into statement and basis, and then let's see how this works.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with it being, I don't think it should be in the rule absent consideration of correlative rights in kind of a broad term. And I don't know that at some point in the future, we're not going to see caps with minority interest that is going to change our mind. That is going to be the right decision to make in that regard. And I don't want to exclude that today in these deliberations, again, with our limited experience in doing this. And I just think it's really impactful and something that I've seen in real life where, and I'll use you and I, Mr. Chair Robbins, you own 35 square miles. I own one right in the middle. And I say, you know what, Chair Robbins, I'm going to take those 35 square miles and I'm going to control the operations. I'm going to control the costs. I'm going to control the timing, and you'll get your checks when you get them. I don't think that a lot of people would be very comfortable in that situation. I don't think a lot of people find a lot of fairness in that situation. And that's really what I'm trying to address here in this very rambling and inarticulate way.
Thank you. I would be perfectly fine for you to develop my minerals. Director Murphy, I see you're unmuted. Would you like to weigh in on this topic?
I would, Chair, and I think, you know, as I look at this, as I said before, I support the removal of a mineral ownership percentage for a couple of the reasons. I want to put a little bit finer point on the majority minority piece, because I think we could also see arenas where we have a plurality, right? We don't have a strict 75-25 split. We might have a 33%, a 40%, 12, and something else. And in my mind, if the point is to get an operator in place who can do all of the things that the cap requires, that is a good day for our commission. If in moving through that process, they're a 12% owner and somebody comes in and says, hey, I actually have 25%, that isn't fair, we can evaluate that, I think, under correlative rights, under waste, and also under kind of the fundamental fairness of the act itself that it imposes on. And I'm regurgitating arguments that have come forward in my time with this commission on these different points, but I think that there are some statutory tools to think about. But I just, I would reiterate that flexibility at this point is key. Getting an operator willing to look at and kind of pursue this overarching goal is a really good thing. And I'd hate to have a percentage preclude us from looking at that, recognizing it may create some risk on the back end if that were the only problem with a cap as proposed when the commission was ultimately considering it. I think that so.
Okay, are we comfortable then in leaving this topic and leaving it as it is with the statement of basis and purpose language? I think so. Okay, seeing nodding of heads up and down, we will now move forward. AAG minor, where are we at this point?
I believe the next 300 series topic on the list is another thing that I believe also Commissioner Gonzalez raised, which is Rule 309F2 and CDPHE's ability to request additional time for consultation.
Commissioner Gonzalez, the floor is yours.
Commissioner Nanjapa had her hand up first, so I'll let her go.
Sorry, Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. I actually did, and I'm going to do a little bit of what you said you dislike, Mr. Chair, and that's going backwards just a little bit. And this may have already come up. Obviously, I was a little bit distracted when I was fixing lunch for my daughter, so I may have missed this, and I apologize, and I'll commit to reviewing the video. But there was a question that had come up from the parties about quantitative versus qualitative information, especially with respect to the terrestrial and aquatic wildlife resources and ecosystems. And, you know, I did note there was kind of, you know, in some instances we have qualitative, in some instances we have quantitative. Some of that I'm sure is just due to what's out there and what's available. And I think in particular with some of the wildlife groups, you know, they noted that I think previously or in a prior statement, they said, you know, qualitative was not enough. And then they, in a more recent statement, said that the quantitative is better, but when not available, qualitative. So I was just curious if staff had comments on kind of that general, the more general sort of use of qualitative versus quantitative, and when those, you know, what the decisions were for one versus the other. But if that was something that we could insert, it applies to both 303 and 314 sections.
AAG minor, Director Murphy.
I can start. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Director Murphy may have more. And I'll start with, as always, staff can do whatever you direct it to in the rules. So they are your rules, not staff's. You know, staff did try to sort of tailor qualitative versus quantitative to really carefully think about what the form is going to look like, right? You know, is this a box where you input a number? Is it a narrative description? And thinking about the types of information that would be useful. So there was certainly attention paid to the use of those terms, and it doesn't mean that at the Commission's direction that can't be changed. You know, all of this is still open, and I think that the general guiding principle staff used is that when there was tangible, measurable data that staff knew was available, staff asked for quantitative information. And in cases where there wasn't always necessarily a very clear data set that operators should have access to, staff tended to use qualitative, and sometimes we used both, where there are sort of multiple subcategories under a single rule. So that's a background information with the caveat that, of course, the rules can say what you think they should say.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and AAG Minor. I think that's helpful. I think, so I would just say, and I would defer to staff, but there were some comments with the wildlife hunting and angling groups, as well as the Wildlife and Biological Resource Coalition, I think, that related to this. And in particular, I think the wildlife hunting and angling groups, that they were the ones who had noted that initially they thought qualitative was not enough, and they wanted quantitative, but now they kind of came back in the closing statement saying that they would rather see, both. Sort of quantitative is the ideal, but if not available, then qualitative. And I think that is important, especially when it comes to these particular bits of information, because there isn't a ton of those data out there now, but there may be more later. And so I think it'd be useful to have kind of both of those noted in that evaluation.
Others with thoughts here? Director Murphy or Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add that I agree with Commissioner Nanjapa. I think when the quantitative analysis is not available, then the qualitative is probably at least beneficial and helpful. And it sounds to me like there's language that operators are familiar with over on the federal side, correct?
Can I jump? I'm going to jump in with a question. Joel, AG Minor, can you scroll down just a little bit? And one of the reasons I think in subpart 4, the terrestrial and aquatic wildlife resources and ecosystems, we specifically used quantitative is because CPW wanted that kind of quantitative data set. And so if we're moving to, so I'm a little bit leery of moving to qualitative in that instance, but maybe there's a way to, if not available, but at the same time, I feel like what is described in subpart 4 is very qualitative. Like, if you ought to know the size of your surface disturbance, and these feel like very measurable things to me. And if I've misheard something, please jump in.
Commissioner Nanjapa, Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going back really quick to try to look at the comments from the wildlife hunting and angling groups in particular, but I believe the gist was that it was more of a, quantitative is the ideal, but when not available, qualitative. And I'm trying to see, I would just say, I would just, not to belabor this, but, just maybe to go back and look at what they provided in their closing statements, because I think there was a little bit of additional information on their reasoning, and that may be, and I would be comfortable with the staff kind of taking that and running with it and determining what would be the appropriate course of action for the next revision. But I think that I hear what you're saying, Director Murphy, that, quantitative, and to fully agree that makes the most sense, when it's available. But I think there are some instances where it may not be available. And of course, some of this may also depend on what sorts of decisions we end up making in 1200 in terms of what we're evaluating here.
Others with thoughts here? Okay, seeing none. Commissioner Messner. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to be clear, so Commissioner Nanjapa, I think what you're suggesting is, a quantitative evaluation of potential impacts. If a quantitative evaluation is not feasible, it could be substituted by a qualitative. Is that what you're indicating would be helpful in this particular situation? I mean, right now, as it reads, you have to do both.
Right. If I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Commissioner.
Yeah, I think, right. I think the language that AAG minor has there, I think I would just take as a placeholder, but I would recommend, looking at what the parties have provided, which is more of a this, but if not available, then that, and so it's not a this and that, or a, one or the other kind of thing. I guess it's sort of that indication of the quantitative being the preference, but when not feasible or not available, or then a qualitative analysis would be important as well. And I think that's just part of, my understanding is that some of these data are just not really available in certain cases. I think the particular subparts, as Director Murphy was talking about, the list of high priority habitats within a mile and the total acreage, but this is where I was sort of getting at that, depending on what sort of decisions we make, some of these things could potentially shift a bit after 1200. And so I, without getting, like I said, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but I would just recommend that staff look at those comments by the wildlife groups and see what you think would be appropriate.
Director Murphy.
Thank you. I asked this mostly kind of as a kind of procedural question, and my thought is it's for the commission to make a decision about whether to include or not the qualitative language today, and then maybe flag this as a place for a conforming change based on what happens in wildlife. And the reason I say that is that there is a possibility we may be done with 200 through 600 today, and staff, we don't really have capacity to look at closing statements and come back to you and present it to you and let you have a discussion and dialogue about it. And so as I think through process, my recommendation would be to either include it or don't, and then we'll flag kind of the CIDR database question as a place to come back as if we need a conforming edit based on the 1200 series discussion. And I think AEG Davenport, if I've gone off the rails in terms of process, rein me back in.
AAG Davenport.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No reining needed, I don't believe, reining in. So I'm in agreement with what Director Murphy just said.
All right, what do we want to do, Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Murphy. I appreciate that direction for what would be most helpful, because yeah, definitely don't want to create additional work for you, but I also didn't want to, get too far into the weeds. So I was trying to strike a balance myself. I think just looking at the wildlife hunting and angling group's closing statement, they gave an example of where maybe the quality of the habitat might be disrupted. And perhaps there's not the quantitative information available, but there is a qualitative evaluation that might be able to be done to determine how that would impact the populations that would be useful, in making these decisions. And so anyway, their specific language is a quantitative or comma, where quantitative information is not reasonably available, comma, a qualitative. So I'm comfortable with that if the other commissioners are comfortable with that, but we would defer to others.
Other commissioners' thoughts? Commissioner McGowan has a thumbs up. Commissioner Gonzalez, thumbs up. Commissioner Messner. All right, let's insert that language, remove the brackets. Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa, for that constructive dialogue and approach. And thank you, Director Murphy, for calling us honest and ensuring that we are moving this ball forward. AAG minor, what is next on our list?
Okay, I think now is probably when the next thing on the list would be Commissioner Gonzalez's question about CDPHE consultation and potentially extending that time frame. So maybe I can scroll down to 309 F2. And I believe I have highlighted the applicable language.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is kind of one of those things that I think is, again, lacks certainty. I don't think it's a huge deal, and I think we can work through it. But I have concerns, and as everyone here has heard, with kind of open-ended nature of certain rules. And this one, as it applies to timing, right? There's kind of buffers throughout this rule, and there's the catch-all: the director may extend the consultation period indefinitely, as directed or requested by CDPHE. And I'm just wondering if there's some bounds we can put on that.
Do you have specific thoughts in mind, Commissioner Gonzalez? Are you asking of staff to see if they've got thoughts?
I'm asking of staff and of the other commissioners, does anyone share this concern? CDPHE, Commissioner Putnam, I'm curious, if he has any ideas. Again, I just think in trying to be artful in drafting these rules and trying to be deliberate and precise in drafting these rules, where I see open-endedness or ambiguity or uncertainty, I'm going to ask that we try and add some more clarity. And so that's what I'm doing here. I don't have a particular suggestion. Again, it's not a huge deal to me, but I think it's important that we discuss it. So I'd like to hear from Commissioner Putnam, who had his hand up.
Yep, Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. So first, I think our intent and hope would be that we could do the consultation within 45 days for most or the vast majority of cases. However, if you take a look at the cost-benefit analysis that staff put together for the rules, it projected a roughly 5 to 10-fold increase in the number of these consultations that CDPHE would do. And that was before amending the cumulative impacts requirement to apply to all applications. To be perfectly blunt about this, we didn't get additional resources from Senate Bill 181 to do those consultations. And I don't have additional staff to put at it unless I take them off of other permitting work or inspection work or other sort of things. And so knowing that the balance here is supposed to be on behalf of protecting public safety and welfare, we wanted to make sure that we had the time to be able to provide as thoughtful a review as we can. And without really knowing how many applications we're all going to be seeing at that point, it's hard for me to kind of estimate how much time I'd need to pull from something else and what the implications of that would be to provide a more precise time. So again, I'd put this in the learn by doing category. And one of the things that we'd like to do is work with the staff of the commission to try to create templates and forms and processes to kind of make as much of that consultation standard as we can to reduce workload, make it most efficient, so that we really focus on the things that may be unique to a particular circumstance. But a lot of the questions I think will relate both on the air, water, and waste side. I guess that's three things, so not both. Will relate to best management practices and impacts, and some of those I think will be relatively common, and we can reduce those to standard procedures, forms, guidance, those sorts of things, and we'll look for those opportunities to be efficient.
Response, Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Putnam. I completely understand, why that's there. That's no surprise to me at all. But I think that that for all the reasons you just stated, that there's a foreseeable potentially, or an opportunity for a backlog to really just gin up while it's waiting for that consultation, that evaluation. And we all work under deadlines for various reasons, and we all work with the resources we have, and I wouldn't want lack of resources to be the reason why responsible and good permitting isn't done for oil and gas operations. And so in that consultation, I don't have a number to suggest. If you asked me, I'd say another 45 days. But I share the concern. I share it from kind of a 360 view as well. I don't know if staff has any ideas on that, or if I've just stated my piece and we move on.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do appreciate again the desire for some certainty there, some bookends. I do think inherent in there, it creates some bookends, which is additional time is necessary to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the adverse environmental impacts. If that's not enough, my suggestion would be if we're looking for certainty and we don't have certainty, then the timeline gets longer. And so if we want to do that, then I would suggest that the initial timeline be 60 days with an additional 60-day review period, understanding that it may certainly be less than that to review, but if we're going to try to create certainty and we're going to try to put numbers in there, then we need to have those numbers achievable, and so they're going to have to be bigger numbers.
Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. And the piece that I was going to echo is the commitment to be coordinating with CDPHE so that it's teams. I mean, poor Mr. Hackett gets to coordinate all of these competing folks and pieces and timings and schedules, and he does a really great job of it. But I think that even last night, Commissioner Putnam and I had a very constructive conversation about how to start creating some efficiencies in the process in terms of data gathering. And, that builds out into a number of the other conversations we've been having today about how do we align our work with that of CDPHE in terms of database submittal data that's coming in. How does it complement what CDPHE is gathering? How do we identify synergies? So the point I want to make more importantly than anything is when we get to the implementation side, designing strategies that facilitate and expedite our respective agencies' ability to provide their expertise is really important to me. If that means we're looking at joint guidance documents, that's great. I realize none of that overcomes the fundamental question that Commissioner Gonzalez has posed, though. So I don't have a perfect solution. I just commit that we will work hard to ensure that CDPHE has the best and information available to it to best utilize its resources.
Commissioner McGowan, and then Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm obviously very sympathetic, empathetic to not having enough resources and trying to do more with less. I also think that just leaving something open-ended is probably not fair to the applicant. And so I would be supportive to some sort of idea along the lines of Commissioner Messner, where there's a number of days with the opportunity to give it an extension by the conferring or consulting sister agency.
Commissioner Nanjapa, and then Commissioner Putnam.
I didn't have a question, Mr. Chair, but I support this idea that Commissioner McGowan has raised.
Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, commissioners. I think we can work with something like that. I think especially with the efficiencies that should be gained. Again, I think this is one of the things that we learned by doing. If we see fewer, cleaner applications, it'll be really easy to live within these timeframes. If we see more complicated and less clearly protective applications, it may be harder to do that. And, you know, we may just have to revisit those questions. And at some point, if we are overwhelmed with a lot of not particularly strong applications, we may come to a point where we just can't do a complete job on that. And we will have to tell you that we haven't been able to do that complete work within that time, but at least there's time certainty associated with that.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. Is there a consensus around the McGowan proposal?
Messner proposal.
The Messner proposal with the McGowan edit. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, no, I support this. I think that any kind of buffer we put is going to be a good thing. It's going to make the rules better. I will leave it up to Director Murphy and Commissioner Putnam to figure out what's going to work best for organizations, and look forward to seeing that number come back.
All right, I'm seeing thumbs up around the horn. Thank you, AAG Minor, for the continual edits. And once AAG Minor is done with that, we'll go back to our list. I think that establishes we've made our way through the issues identified for Rule 300. Do we want to just go sequentially and go into Rule 400 now? Maybe 404D, equally or more protective language at the bottom. Which commissioner put this on the list? Is that Commissioner Gonzalez?
Yeah, at some point I'm going to stop. I'm going to relinquish all the time, and you can stop hearing my voice. Yeah, this goes. I mean, we brought this up yesterday. It's the varying standard that we have at various places in the rules. What I'm advocating for is that any changes associated with 404D are protective and minimize adverse impacts to public health, welfare, safety, the environment, and wildlife resources. I don't think that we should have this equally protective or more protective standard that kind of applies to various rules here and there. Same argument I had with substantially equivalent, and so that my mind hasn't been changed on having those varying standards in the rules, and so that's where I stand on that. And I'll leave it up to the commissioners for joining this deliberation.
Do other commissioners, Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as I read this, 404D, it says if an operator submits a Form 4 proposing change to a previously approved, right? And I think that's important to note, is that the previously approved piece, and that they're asking for a change. And so what it's saying is that we can approve that change if it is as equally protective as the previously approved one. So it's a very clear metric to me, and I think that's important. So there's a reason. There's deliberations. There's there was, thought given to why there was a initial approval to the noise, light, odor, or dust plan, and it went through a significant process. And so to be able to change that in a Form 4 with the simple guideline to just say that it's protective, I'm not sure accomplishes what I think needs to be accomplished.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I understand how this interacts from a previously approved site. And what I get at, the scenarios that I envision are an operator comes out, they say, hey, here's what we're going to do. We say, man, that looks great. What an idea. What a way to mitigate. I think that's going to be super protective. That's great. And the operator comes back and says, hey, we had these ideas. Turns out they're not going to work for this site for whatever reason or not. But we have these other things, and they are still going to protect and minimize adverse impacts. Now, are they going to be as great as what we had? Maybe not. Maybe that technology doesn't apply in those circumstances, but we still have something that's very good and that meets the standard. Why should that operator have to raise up to the standard they had previously aimed for but weren't able to achieve? I feel like that may disincentivize operators from shooting high in that first instance and just saying, hey, here's the bare minimum we're going to do. It protects, get that approved. Anything else is kind of the Cadillac or the buffer. But when I see someone coming in with something that's good or great or whatever, and then they can't accomplish it for whatever reason, it doesn't work, and they choose something else that still meets the threshold, I don't know why we should disallow them from moving forward with that standard or with that mitigation.
Commissioner Messner, your response?
I hear what you're saying. I think you're looking at worst case scenarios. I think two things here. I think one, the previously approved noise, light, odor, dust plan, I guess I'm assuming as I'm reading this, that it would be approved by the commission, and this is a director change. And so, yeah. I think this is not a difficult bar, I don't think, to overcome. And so I don't think it's like some attempt to put in some roadblocks or some barriers into this process. It's just clarifying that, you can't go in there and, say you're going to do these things on every single one of your application. And then when it comes down to it, you're just like, yeah, you know what? I think we're just actually going to go here and it'll be fine because it's protected, right? And so I do think that this is an important check and balance.
Commissioner Gonzalez?
Yeah, no, I think that however high the bar is, that bar is set by that initial application. So that's the bar, right? The bar is not protect or minimize. The bar is what was approved by that initial application. What I'm saying is that bar can't be achieved for whatever reason or not, and something that is also protective. I don't think that anyone's trying to say, I just don't want to do it anymore. I think people are going to commit to whatever they're saying they're going to do to the best they can. And if they can't, I still think they should be able to maintain their operations if it is protective and minimize adverse impacts. And so the bar is not high if the bar is set low initially. The bar is pretty high if it's set high initially, right? That's what I'm getting at, is that the bar we're setting at is the previously approved application. And so that's why I think it's something that we should review under the same standard, kind of a re-review of whatever the plan is.
Commissioner Messner?
And I appreciate that, but we're not reviewing it. The director is. And so I think that's the difference to me. And so, anyway, I hear what you're saying. I don't think this is, really a challenge. It's just saying it's equally protective as the initial plan. So I think it says the same thing. So I'm comfortable with the language as it stands.
Okay, so comfortable with the language as it stands. Commissioner Gonzalez, do you have specific language you would like to float out for the rest of us to consider?
Language that says, where am I? Oh, the director may approve the proposed change only if it is protective and minimizes adverse impacts to public health, welfare, safety, wildlife, the environment. That's it. It's a standard. It's a standard for our commission.
AAG minor, this language came about in the September 18th draft from staff. And I know that was based upon direction from us, but I'm sort of circularly lost here. How did this language get developed before we consider the language that Commissioner Gonzalez has put on the table.
Mr. Chair, in your collectively, you all's deliberation about the 400 series, you directed staff to provide that in Rule 404 that a Form 4 sundry notice requesting change to one of those categories of plans would only be granted if it provided, I think, sort of equally protective or more protective. I can't remember if you used exactly that language, but that was the sort of concept, was don't allow changes to although we added sort of a recognition that there could be multiple plans submitted for noise, dust, odor, and light, et cetera, at your direction. The idea was that if, knowing operators don't know everything in advance, if they want to make a change to one of those plans in the future, it should be as protective as what was proposed. So this was sort of a specific direction you gave the commission, though, or the staff, though I don't think you did specifically use the equally protective or more protective language. I think staff kind of came up on with that after listening more to what you had said.
Thank you for that explanation. What's the consensus here, commissioners, in terms of the proposed language? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the only thing that that's kind of niggling at me is if part of the success of the original OGTP was we had this really innovative noise plan, or we're going to go do something different with lighting, and that's how you was part of your community engagement or the way you got folks to buy in, and then you, for whatever reason, you honestly can't make that happen. But the expectation from those living around that operation were, well, I thought we were getting this, and now we're not getting this, and it's not. It's protective, but it's not as protective as the thing I thought we were getting. I think that's where I'm getting stuck. I see what you're saying, but I also am wondering if in some places there's going to be an expectation of what's been agreed to. And if we don't say it's not as equally as protective as what you originally had in your application, that someone might feel like something was done without kind of more of a full vetting.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
I think that's a really, really great point, specifically with the expectation of the stakeholders that that are participating in this process through notice and through the original OGDB. So I think that's a really great and well taken point, Commissioner McGowan. One thing I would want to ask staff before we moved on from this is, what happens if the director chooses to deny an amendment to one of the forms or to a sundry notice form 4 for one of the existing plans? Is there an opportunity for an applicant to appeal that to the full commission?
I can try, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes. AG Minor.
So there's no specific appeal written into the Form 4 rule, Commissioner Gonzalez. However, I think this would sort of fall under my favorite rule, which is 503 G10, which is the opportunity to request a hearing on all other matters. I will say that in practice, I think that's unlikely. I think what typically happens with a sundry notice is that it really provides an opportunity for dialogue between staff and the operator submitting the sundry notice. And so I'm not sure I'm familiar with specific instances of sundries getting denied. I'm sure that happens, but I think the more likely scenario in the case you identified is that Mr. Leonard and his staff would, really work closely with the operator and come up with a way to still provide equivalent protections, even if it isn't the way that the operator first identified on the sundry they submitted, suggesting a change that maybe didn't seem quite right to staff. I hope that adequately answers the question, and perhaps Director Murphy has more to add.
Director Murphy thinks you did a fine job there. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, AG Minor, and I've seen firsthand operators working with staff to find the best solution and to get there. And I really appreciate that when it's done. These whole plans are new, right? We're talking about new rules, what we're talking about. We haven't seen them. We don't know how they operate. We don't know what this bar looks like. And I'm just, I'm uncomfortable with having a standard that doesn't match the standard that we've set that's been set for us by statute. And I truly appreciate, the insight from Commissioner McGowan, really dialing it into the stakeholders. And I think that's a fair consideration. I'm not going to stand in the way of this rule as written, but I'm voicing my concern as I have in the past. And I appreciate the opportunity through the 503, I don't remember the letters and numbers behind it, opportunity to bring this to a hearing should an operator choose. And I appreciate staff's continued engagement with operators through the Form 4 sundry process.
All right. What's the straw vote on keeping this language or keeping it as is? About how many people want to just keep it as is? Okay, Commissioner Gonzalez, I appreciate your consistent recognition of these things. I think that I'm gonna play my inner Commissioner Putnam, and that we're gonna need to sort of see how this looks in 6-8 months, a year, and I always agree that there's a chance for revisiting, and we're not gonna get all this completely dialed in. And so let's give it a shot and let's see how it works. And then we will see where we are in a period of time. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Sorry, I may have jumped the gun, Mr. Chair, but I don't believe we've raised, we'll have to look at the list of issues, but I did have something in 405. So I just wanted to flag that, that I think I forgot to raise when we were going through our issues earlier.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and raise that, because that would be next, and it is not indeed on our list. So why don't you flag it for us?
Okay, thank you very much. And I also just wanted to comment that I appreciate Commissioner Gonzalez raising that last issue and the discussion on that. I think, but especially the points raised by Commissioner McGowan. I think that was really a good discussion, so I appreciate that. Let's see. So for Form 42, so I have a sort of a two-part question, I guess. One, I think I know the answer, but it had come up from a couple of different parties. So just wanted to have either Director Murphy or AAG Minor address the issue of notice. I think there were some questions about certain stages of operations, for example, construction or seismic operations, and whether parties could opt in for notice. And I know I did talk a little bit with Director Murphy and others about this, and it may be more difficult, especially on a location by location basis. So I just wanted to just touch on that. But the other thing I wanted to just take a little bit of time maybe to think through is whether there's anything that we may be able to do to evaluate conditions if they have changed upon construction. So in other words, if there's been a location that's been approved and a couple of years go by, and by that point, some new construction has begun that's within the, the distance that we had approved from the nearest residence. Now there's new residential construction or something happening. Is there anything we can do at that point to further mitigate, any of the potential nuisance issues? So I guess that, again, first is a question for the staff, and then maybe for some discussion.
Director Murphy?
Thank you, Commissioner, for what I would say is kind of a two-part question. One is about notice, having the ability for folks to opt into notice, for lack of a better term. And the second question about once a permit's been issued, what what tools are available. And that one I will absolutely defer to the lawyers because it makes me a little nervous. But I think both AAG Davenport and AAG Minor can answer that one. With regard to, I think I want to start by first stating what I said when we first started talking about Form 42s and the notices in the 400 series, and that these are notices that are really necessary to drive our agency's work. And so I know other people get benefits from them. And I know all of you know this because I said it a million times, but I can't help myself from restating it because it's just so important to how we as an organization are able to do our work. Any added benefit from that in terms of notices to other people or engagement is great. And I think that we've engaged with a number of, with both CPW and CDPHE to understand exactly which notices they want so that we can be in coordination with our co-regulatory or I hate sister agencies, but that's the right word. That's the only word I can come up with right now, with our partners across state government. So those two pieces. The third one, the hardest thing about the opting into notice is that right now how our notice systems work, whether it's LGD notices or electronic notices of applications, is it's kind of an in or out program for the most part. And that's largely because of GIS and IT limitations in that, and the example that I would use is the one that has come forward a couple of times to me in my tenure here with the commission. Folks have said, I just want to know what's going on in my neighborhood. You know, that I'd like updates. I don't want to know statewide. I just want to know right here. And that is a powerful and a powerful ask, and one that I would like to be able to be like, yep, we got that. The challenge for us to actually manage that is creating a specific GIS sub-location within the state that if a notice came in, our system would automatically know it needs to go out to this person. And so we've got to manage a specific GIS polygon and then credentials for somebody to come into or out of our system. And that we are not staffed to handle that broadly. And so we've had to rely on other tools and the creation of, for example, the daily activity dashboard to give people line of sight into geographically represented information about what is going on either in their municipality, to some degree in their county, in proximity to whatever particular geographic area they care about. I think that that's been a really great tool, and I think we can continue to explore how to make it more functional, because I think the ask resonates with me. It's just very difficult to actually implement at that very granular level. And so what I would say is, yes, I think we need to continue to work on this. And that's a really, really long-winded answer to a very precise question. I'm sorry, Commissioner. And with that, I might say AAG Minor or AAG Davenport, do you want to tackle question 2?
I am happy to start if I may, Mr. Chair, though I think you promised to ask Mr. Davenport first today so that I can say V2, but I will defer.
It's okay. AAG Minor.
So to answer the second part of your question, Commissioner Nanjapa, staff's position is that there are numerous challenges associated with modifying the terms of an existing permit under the law. There's a provision in the State Administrative Procedure Act that would govern that type of modification. And so the sort of go back and check what's happened since the permit has been issued before construction happens, and then modify the permit would require, at the very least, compliance with that provision of the APA. And there are potentially other legal restrictions associated with, choose my words carefully here, with potential changes to a permit that a party has already acted in reliance upon. That said, there are a lot of other tools that staff has at its disposal to work with operators to address issues as they come up in different contexts as locations change over their lifetime. I would just note that, for example, operators often submit Form 2 application for permits to drill a well after the Form 2A and sometimes a while after, or similarly, perhaps a permit application to convert a production well to an injection well, which we'll hear more about in the 800 series soon. And if conditions have changed at a location since the Form 2A for the location was approved, there are provisions in Rule 308 governing Form 2 that allows the staff, that is an administrative approval, not a commission approval, to consider those sort of changes to the location and what perhaps additional measures are necessary to protect public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources associated with the approval or denial of the Form 2 permit. So that, I don't know if that directly answers your question. Perhaps Mr. Davenport would like to add more, but I think that's sort of my basic legal overview of why you do not see rules that would sort of reflect changes to an approved permit at the construction stage in the 400 series.
Thank you, AAG Minor. Any follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't see AAG Davenport coming forward, so he may not have anything to add, but I would welcome any input from him. But yeah, I guess I just wanted to say that this was something that just continues to just bother me a little bit, in that, you know, as I think I've said, you know, whatever distance we establish, you know, from the location of the where the well is going to go in, and the well pad location to a residence or anything else, does not preclude other land use decisions that come after the fact to build closer. And that, so I continue to try to think about if there's anything that we might be able to do to help mitigate, you know, those impacts sort of after the fact. And I know we also, because of the construction also involving the consultation with, you know, CPW and proximate and relevant local governments, you know, maybe there's some, you know, measures that they can take, because to a certain extent, some of, not CPW, but for the local governments, some of those decisions may be, you know, within their purview in the first place. So all of that to say that I guess I just want to voice that concern, and hoping that the relevant and proximate local governments that are listening can maybe also think about ways that some of those nuisance issues can be mitigated. You know, if there are, you know, new activities that are occurring after the location has been approved by us. And I guess one point of clarification, and I apologize, AAG Minor, if you already mentioned this, but there would still be, wouldn't there be a notice to all of the residential building occupants and owners or tenants in this instance, or is that not correct in this instance?
I believe the chair authorized me to speak, but was on mute. So yes, there are some notifications. The 400 series is so long, I apologize, it's hard to scroll efficiently. But it's in Rule 412. That's the surface owner notice, which is a statutory requirement that surface owners be given notice prior to drilling operations, as well as the move-in, rig-up, or MIRU notice, which is notice to surface owners, building unit owners, and tenants when a rig comes to the site, essentially. And so that is not necessarily a construction notice. That's not notice of the well pad being constructed, but it does provide notice to nearby residents when sort of the most impactful activities occur. And if I may actually continue, Mr. Chair, I think to sort of address your other point, Commissioner Njapa, about nuisance, it's a good time to think again about how retroactivity functions in the rules, and in which rules are prospective and which are retroactive. And so while many rules in the 400 series and in the nuisance rules in particular are sort of thinking about things at the application stage, right? Submitting a plan as part of a Form 2A application. there are others that are operational rules, and those apply sort of prospectively at, going forward. So the idea that operators will use best management practices to minimize odors when they're near a residential building unit, that's something that is an operational requirement. And so I think that might perhaps address some of your question about, well, how are we protecting residents going forward and not just at the permitting stage? Aside from the plans, most of the nuisance rules are prospective with a few exceptions that I can get into if you'd like.
Director Murphy, you're unmuted. Did you want to add to this?
I think the only thing that I wanted to add is, and Commissioner Ninjaba, you touched on it well, that the increased coordination and collaboration with local governments is really important in this space in terms of planning for development, both regardless of what industry or type of development is being put forward. So, I really welcome the engagement of locals in part because of this piece. The second piece that's important to me in this space is, to me, this is one of the primary functions of permit expirations, is to ensure that there is a reasonable amount of time for an operator to act, but also not so much that there's a huge change in conditions, and that's a very fine line to walk. And I know that some of our industry folks have said that we haven't given them enough time in that space, but that to me is a bit of a balance, and one that has been proposed to you by staff in these rule series too. So,
thank you, Director Murphy. Further thoughts on this from Commissioner Nanjapa or others? Okay, good discussion. AAG minor, if we could go back to our list. .423 noise. I believe this was Commissioner Nanjapa had something on this, but I don't know what it was, and I could be wrong entirely.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe this was mine. Just scrolling into my notes here. Let's see. I think it was, I just wanted to make sure that I was reading something correctly. Let me get there. Okay. So I think my particular question was in 423B to capital B. B2 capital B. Okay, yeah. So I guess I just had a question in that in most of the other instances, there is a difference in the decibel level for the 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And in this instance, it's the same. And so I just was curious if that was just a typo or if there was a reason for that.
Director Murphy, AAG minor, perhaps Mike Leonard. Do you want to provide perspective on this?
I can begin to answer, and we can always perhaps ask Ms. Larson or Ms. Amaro to zoom in Mr. Leonard if this gets beyond my ability to translate his technical knowledge. But it is not a typo. That was intentional on staff's part to have the same standard, which is a very protective standard, apply during both daytime hours and nighttime hours. Staff has reviewed quite a bit of information and data about the C-scale noise that's available to staff from oil and gas operations and the sort of categories of equipment and operations that generate the C-scale noise tend to be continuous 24-hour operations that don't typically vary a great deal from daytime to nighttime.
Thank you, AAG Minor. Commissioner Nanjapa, follow-up, or other commissioners? I'm not seeing any. I'm comfortable with where this rule has landed. I think this was a change from where it was before we had stakeholder input, and I'm comfortable relying on the expertise of staff, in particular Mike Leonard, who is the noise guru at COGCC, and I know he had numerous discussions with all the parties in getting this rule to where it's at. So are others comfortable with this staff draft? I'm seeing heads nodding up and down. Commissioner Nanjapa, are you comfortable with the explanation? Great. Okay. Let's move onward.
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes, AG Minor.
So I believe that that also concludes the 400 series, unless there are other issues commissioners wish to raise in that series. There was one issue so far flagged in the 500 series, which is goal 507, and I believe also one flagged in the 200 series, transfer of operatorship. Though I see Director Murphy shaking her head, so perhaps I missed one.
Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. The only other piece, and I'm sorry to belabor this point, but there were a couple of changes that Kinder Morgan had suggested in the 400 series around considering federal pieces, and I think that they're appropriate to incorporate and want to make sure that I have assent to incorporate them from the commissioners themselves.
Yeah, I think we gave a thumbs up to that earlier.
Yeah, there's one place but there was one place where staff did not agree with Kinder Morgan's suggestion, and so I'm kind of going through the ones where we did. The one where we didn't or had concerns was in the CIDR database, I believe. And I think it was covered elsewhere, but I do think that the language that was suggested in the 400 series made a lot of sense. So
I'm very comfortable deferring to staff on that. All right. Looking at our list, I believe we have Rule 218, transfer of ownership flagged in Rule 507. Is that right? Which one of us flagged Rule 218, transfer of operatorship? Commissioner Gonzalez and Commissioner Nanjapa and Commissioner McGowan. We'll go in Commissioner Nanjapa. Bill pointed to you, at least on my screen. That's what it looked like.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Commissioner Gonzalez. Bear with me while I pull open my notes here. I think generally I just wanted to make sure, because we had raised concerns previously, that we were all kind of comfortable with the various pieces of where it landed. I think I had a question, which I know I asked during that part of the hearing, with respect to the time frame. So let's see here. And maybe it's just more of a wording thing that was kind of throwing me off the time. And I know AAG minor clarified for me. So in this is in 218B, where the intent form, it says that the filing of Form 9 transfer of operatorship intent with the commission at least 30 days or as soon as practicable before the anticipated transfer date. And similar to what Commissioner Gonzalez had said before, in reading this, kind of just thinking of it as a layperson and not sort of understanding the overall sort of process, to me that seemed like 30 days or greater. But what I understood was that was to accommodate what we heard, from the parties, that often these transactions are, occurring right up to the, or the discussions and the details are occurring right up to the closing date. Yeah, I don't know, maybe this is just my concern, but I just wanted to flag it. It seemed a little bit less than clear to me in terms of what is intended there. And it may just be a little bit of wordsmithing that the staff can handle, but I'll just throw that out there for folks to address. And then more generally, just wanted to make sure that we had the various pieces covered in the transfer of operatorship now with the changes otherwise. So.
Commissioner Gonzalez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think as to Commissioner Nanjapa's concern, I mean, the way I read Form 9 is that these are a way for us, the commission, and specifically staff, to really understand and manage and be able to work with the changing dynamic of ownership for these permits. So for me, when I think about that 30 days or as soon as practicable, I think that takes into account the nature of business transactions, specifically in the oil and gas space. And I would defer to staff on this one. If this works for staff, it's to their benefit to have that time frame and that certainty, or that as practicable standard. So I'll leave that up to Director Murphy to chime in there and make sure that works for her.
Director Murphy?
Thank you, commissioners. We've worked really long and hard on Rule 218, and we do have some thoughts on some of the closing statements you heard and read from industry, and happy to get into those. But overall, I think staff stands by the timing component and kind of the 30 days in advance piece in particular. And we also recognize that there will be some degree of kind of back and forth as the process moves along, and we recognize that. But this is my gut instinct, and is that, it's kind of the 80-20 rule. If you can get most of it, we're going to be a lot better on the day that the transaction or the transfer is complete than we would today. And this is one of the places where we really identified substantial staff savings by being able to get in front of some of these transfers.
Commissioner McGowan or Commissioner Gonzalez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I feel like this is the section where we still have a lot of feedback from industry about their concerns that sometimes they don't know exactly which assets being transferred till last minute. And then our staff really feeling like it's helpful to have as much information up front. And so I was just wanting a little information from Director Murphy about the back and forth between folks and where we felt we were at, and stop there.
Commissioner Gonzalez, did you raise your hand again?
No, I just wanted to chime in to echo something that Director Murphy had said. Really just acknowledging that it's exhibit. I've done enough business transactions in this space to know that exhibits are changing, sometimes daily, sometimes multiple times a day as you're working through it. For the most part, you're gonna hit that 80-20 rule, and I think that the way it's written with the intent, and then with the most substantial language really being in the subsequent after the transaction has been consummated, I think that's the way it's written well. But I'll let Director Murphy answer Commissioner McGowan's question.
Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, commissioners. So, as Mr. Neslin said yesterday, that he'd hoped to connect and hadn't been able to, and he tried very hard. I was a little scattered earlier this week, so I was able to connect with him and a couple of his clients this morning to talk through some of the changes that were in closing statements. I think that we worked through a number of them successfully. I think that, and I can kind of go through these in a list form. One of the concern is that there's one that we're still working on, and I mean, in the for what it's worth category, kind of we're here working with you online and also kind of trying to work on red lines in the background. So this is a very live conversation right now. I think one of the concerns that industry articulated is the use of the term related to, and this is actually on the screen right now in subpart K, and it occurs in a couple of the other places within Rule 218. And in staff's mind, this has a very narrow meaning, but in my life as a former lawyer, I also know that related to is something we use in discovery to consider everything under the sun possibly that might actually connect to a topic. And those are really different uses of the same word. So we have a much more narrow view of it that I thought we kind of were in some agreement with, but I probably need to follow up with Mr. Neslin. I don't want to oversell it. One of the other components, so that's issue 1. Issue 2, one of the other concerns, and I think Noble's closing statement articulates this in quite a bit of detail, around providing notice to a local government before a transfer is complete. And so when that Form 9 initial comes into staff, and thank you, Joel, you're doing a great job. And my understanding from industry is that they were fine with kind of a post-transfer notice. But given some of the confidentiality concerns and the limits that the commission has on, extending its confidentiality requirements to further parties, coupled with the opportunity for local governments to, pass their own regs to require engagement and communication, industry had a lot of concerns about this. And I'm just going to barrel into this comment and say that we included this this revision at your direction, and so it's really up to you whether you think what the right path is on whether to provide notice to local governments when staff receives notice of a transfer. Staff is pretty agnostic, and in my experience in managing confidentiality requests and data around flow lines, the less we're trying to provide confidential information to other parties, the better place we as a commissioner in. So I understand it's your direction. We're happy to carry it out. At the same time, I would probably lean towards not requiring it. I recognize that a number of local governments think that this is important. So that's issue 2. Issue 3 was around, whether the director needed to approve the initial Form 9, and that created some heartburn. And I think after we walked through staff's view of the process, in that the director would be reviewing the Form 9 intent upon receipt, but would not be approving it until after the completion of the transfer, when the Form 9 subsequent came in, helped alleviate concerns about looking at something on the front end that was did not necessarily represent what the actual transfer would be. So I think we've worked through that, and I think Joel and I are both committed to ensuring that it's abundantly clear in the SPP how that process works, right? The Form 9 comes in, we look at it, we work through it, but there isn't a director approval until we've actually received the Form 9 subsequent and can verify. One of the other components is, connecting the 209E appellate review process to 218 more clearly. And so Joel again has flagged on the screen the process for an operator to seek a very, very speedy review of a director decision to shut in wells if an operator hasn't received approval of the Form 9. I think we have some ideas on that, and Mr. Miner is the right person to ask about it. One of the last pieces that we discussed this morning is in 218D1C around the prior owner attestation language. Staff worked through this and thinks that it would be good and helpful information after talking through it this morning. I understand the challenging place it would leave to contracting operators to deal with a third entity that is not party to the transaction, and because I believe some of the language in B captures the information that's really relevant for staff to evaluate and make decisions and understand who's responsible for what in our database, coupled with the fact that nothing in 218 overrides the responsible party statutory provisions, so that those two pieces coupled together for me means that the attestation in subpart 3 is something that I'm okay deleting if the commissioners are. So those are 5 pretty detailed issues, but wanted to close the loop with the conversations that I've had this morning. I think the one that is still kind of lingering in a pretty unresolved space is around related to. So, if we are going to take an afternoon break, it might give us staff a little bit of time to work through and come back with a slightly more firm answer or position. So.
Thank you, Director Murphy. And before we get to commissioner discussion, I just want to thank you and staff for the multitasking that I know that you have been doing throughout this rulemaking. It is thoroughly appreciated by all of the commissioners as well as all the stakeholders. It really advances the ball for Colorado. Commissioner Gonzalez, I think I saw your hand first, and then Commissioner Nanjapa, and then Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Murphy, for kind of that list. I'd say I had 4 of those 5 on my list as well, and I think the related to tied into a different piece that I had in one of my 4. I would suggest to the chair right now that we kind of take those one at a time, as opposed to us kind of deliberate on all 5 at a with each of our time. And so, if that's fair, I'm happy to kick it off on any one of those topics. I've got some thoughts written down that I'd like to share. So I'll leave that up to the chair's direction.
I'm perfectly fine with that. I think I saw a couple of thumbs from your fellow commissioners. This is an area in which your expertise is something I think we want to hear from.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think then I'll tackle the 218A1K related to language, and then the 218 D1 big D ruminant 3 about the subsequent liability that is also tied to that related to as a transferable item. So when we talk about related to, and we talk about this Form 9 intent, this Form 9 subsequent, and how it operates, I think one of the really important things is that there's a lot of interaction with the staff during this process. And so an operator is going to essentially, if I was the operator, leverage the staff's expertise with their knowledge of the assets and the transferable items and the permits that are subject to a transaction by submitting as much as they can to the director and staff, and taking advantage of that opportunity to essentially have staff help them out with their due diligence on these permits that they're taking over. I believe that once a permit is taken over and once a transferable item is taken over, that does belong with the buying operator, or with the buying operator. That's correct. I think that when we tie in the related to thing, it's kind of a catch-all for anything that wasn't on the Form 9 intent or the Form 9 subsequent. And I think there's plenty of opportunity in that to say, hey, the Form 9 intent has these things listed. We picked up or we didn't get on the Form 9 subsequent these things. But I think to tie in anything that's related to as a transferable item and then stick that with the buying operator is unfair to that buying operator. And I think that staff's can have the opportunity to chime in and talk about that and say, hey, you need to include this, or this is going to be something that's going to be a problem down the line. And so specifically as to 218, little d, 1, big D, ruminant 3, the presumption that a transferable item, and specifically a related to transferred item that is not on the list, and the presumption that went to the buying operator, I think that's unfair to the buying operator based on the reasons that I kind of just stated for this presumption and for the implications of that presumption and for kind of the catch-all related to, even when we've had an exhaustive list at the intent stage, an exhaustive list at the subsequent stage that was looked at and reviewed by staff, as well as the buying and selling operators. I think that covers it. And I don't think it'd be fair to pin the buying operator with any kind of these related to, but not listed permits or facilities that weren't meant to be transferred. Happy to answer any questions for all that too.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. That was informative. Is the primary concern that the list is not exhaustive, or that the term related?
I think the primary concern for an operator would be that something that they did not intend to be transferred over to them, that they did not intend to buy, is something that the commission or the staff may say, hey, that was related to something you bought, so therefore it's your problem now and your liability now. And I think that when you have an exhaustive list, that list should be what that list is. And so it's the related to nature of things that may be tied to that list that aren't captured on that list. And the list itself of transferable items is pretty exhaustive for things that would be subject to the Form 9 and would be part of a transaction.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I guess so. My question is that if the primary concern is the related to piece, I mean, is there additional items that need to be on the list in order to be able to not use the related piece, or is it important to have some line in there to be able to associate something that just like that can't be on a list, or can't always be contemplated to be on the list? Because there's always things that as you try to create a list, it's not always going to capture everything. One other thought that I had is, I mean, I appreciate the related piece, and certainly I'm not interested in having language on there that would be ambiguous as to what that would be. Is the term directly associated a better term? And so those are two questions. Is directly associated a better term, and can we create a list that captures everything?
Commissioner Gonzalez or AAG Minor?
I was going to say that the second part of that question needs to be answered first about the list, and I think that's a question for staff on does something need to be added to the list to really capture what the idea is for the related to.
Director Murphy?
Thank you, Chair. So Commissioner Messner, Commissioner Gonzalez, there's a couple of layers as always to this. And AAG Minor can expound upon this, but I think the language you're concerned about Commissioner Gonzalez, in terms of saying that related pieces shift to the buyer, we need a default, and we do have things that slip through the cracks, and then everybody points at each other in our experience. Not always. Sometimes operators do, sort it out, but we have been left with two operators pointing at each other for a particular facility through a transfer. And so I think AAG Minor can address that in greater detail. With regard to the related language, we're using that somewhat precisely to talk about things that are related in our database. And often a transaction may be, identified by wells, but is silent as to associated pits or other facilities. And so that's part of what we're trying to address with related, not this kind of unending, unlimited connectivity to a particular operation. And so yes, the best outcome is to get a complete list in the first place. But we have a lot of experience with folks not getting us a very complete list and then having to do a ton of homework trying to figure out who's responsible for what. And the other thing that we've learned in those transactions is that once the transfer is complete, folks aren't that keen on helping us solve the problem. And so trying to set out on the front end how we can deal with it has been important to staff. And with that, I'd say, AG Minor, if you want to expound upon that, please do.
Seeing with the chair's permission, I see some nodding. Yes, to all of that. And as Director Murphy said, I think I just want to emphasize that the term related is essentially a term of art of how the Commission's database works. And there are certain categories of items that are essentially physically co-located and functionally connected to a well or another transferred item. And that's basically pits and tanks that don't always show up in the transfer documents. And that is what I think this is intended to get at. Those do meet the definition for the most part of oil and gas facilities, but still tend to get overlooked, even though they are related in the database. And part of this goes back to sort of some complexities that I think I still am perhaps not completely fluent in, and how pits were initially registered in 1997 under the first pit registration rule. But I think that's sort of the category of things that staff is intending to get at with this term related. In terms of this sort of legal question, which I think is establishing a presumption about something that is related in the Commission's database but doesn't show up on the form, there does have to be some assumption going forward, and I think spelling it out in the rules is probably a good, clear way to create expectations for all parties involved of this is the presumption, and if you think it needs to change, you should indicate that on the form. And I think that sort of establishing that presumption in the rule doesn't really interfere with the statutory responsible party provisions, sort of the responsibility for future compliance, and perhaps who is responsible for a prior act are in my mind two different things, though that is one interpretation. I realize there's complex things, and Mr. Davenport may have more to add on that point as well.
AAG Davenport.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have much to add other than I agree that as I understand it, that staff's intent is for related to be something specific in regard to how things are related to in the database, which does actually have online a related link that you can click on to see everything that's related to a location or a well. And that's all I have.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
And that's kind of what I'm getting at is that since it's in the database, it's you type in any one of these facilities that are on the transferred list and it's going to pop up. And so I imagine it's going to be seen, caught on the intent or the subsequent or somewhere in between there. And so I think that's captured already through the Form 9 and 10, the Form of subsequent. And if this language stays with the related to, I would ask that it is then more precisely defined as tied to those facilities or those records that are related to the above list in the database.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate these clarifications. I think that is helpful. And one question I had and maybe missed when you were just talking about the database is there a requirement somewhere else in the rules where the operators have to sort of declare anything new that's being added to the location so that you can keep a running inventory, or how does that work? This is my complete ignorance on the topic here coming out.
AG Minor?
Maybe I shouldn't have unmuted because I think that's a challenging question. And the answer is sort of a lawyer's favorite answer. Different categories of things that meet the definition of oil and gas facilities sort of have different requirements in the commission's rules for how staff or the commissioner are notified that they're being added to a location. Sometimes that's a form, right? Like the form, gosh, I should remember the name. I think it's 18 for the pit permit. And I think other times with things like tanks, there's a little bit more flexibility, I think, in sort of how those move on and off a location. So the answer is it really does vary depending on the category of equipment. And I think in general, the more permanent the structure, the more sort of permitting process it goes through. A pit is a little more permanent than, say, a temporary tank that is just on site during completion practices.
Others with comments around this issue? Director Murphy, you also, I know you mentioned that you're still in conversations. Would it be, and I'm just throwing this out there, but it's 3:30. We've been going at it for over 2 hours. I mean, would it be helpful if we took a break and allowed those conversations to continue, or is that pie in the sky? Or
Chair, I feel pretty good about staff's analysis on all points except for the related to question. I don't really have clear direction on where the commission wants to go on this, and so I can take I would welcome a little bit of time to kind of finalize some revisions that might add some clarity, because we have been working on those, but I haven't had space to think about them. But we don't need to go there. We don't need to go there. So I don't know. I'm trying to kind of like gauge where we're going on this, and maybe seeing the language helps us gauge where we should go. But regardless, I'm probably at about the end of my rope of not having a break also. So
why don't we take 15 and take a break? I think we could all use that. It's 3:31. Let's return at 3:46. It is 3:47. So we will reconvene the deliberation rulemaking on mission change with our staff and parties. Looking to see everybody get on board. Hello, Director Murphy. Looking forward to make sure we've got Commissioner Nanjapa on board. Hello, great. So we were debating certain of the aspects. I think there's maybe 5 elements of 218. And I know Director Murphy, you have been multitasking and having discussions with some of our stakeholders. And I would wonder, it being 3:48 now, that it is unlikely, if not impossible, that we're going to get through all deliberations on the 200 through 600 series today. We have Monday set aside for another hearing date, and I want to throw out the proposal of, suppose we finish giving you sort of direction, but then allow you the weekend to have additional discussions and see if you can come back to us on 218 on Monday. I think we're all firmly of the position that we don't want to get this done just to get it done. We want to get this done and we want to get it right. So putting you on the spot here, Director Murphy, but could you opine about that to us?
Yes, Director, you'll get a better work product from us on 218 if we have a little more time than if we try to get it to you in the next 10 minutes. We're still deeply engaged in dialogue.
Are there thoughts from other commissioners about that concept? Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the concept. I just had one other tiny piece related to the 218 and some of the comments that Director Murphy had raised before. And the one I just want to make sure that I understood, was there a potential proposal to strike that notice to local governments prior to of the intent form? Did I understand that correctly?
That was my understanding, is that we were supposing that we not do that at the intent stage and didn't allow, and I, again, believe that local governments can regulate themselves into notice if they so desire. Director Murphy?
Chair, I think that I'm going to lay this out chronologically in that staff proposed to the commissioners its proposed Rule 218. Commissioners heard from the parties and heard that it would be helpful for some local governments to get advance notice of a transfer, and said, staff, can you put that into rules? Staff has put that into rules. Folks or some industry folks in their closing statement said that this is really problematic and we have concerns about it. And at least I heard yesterday from commissioners it'd be a good idea to kind of check in on where we are on 218, because it seemed like the problems could be solvable, and so this is one of them. And what I would say from staff's perspective is that we're pretty agnostic about including it. It doesn't further our business needs as an agency, and so it's really up to the commissioners about whether they think as a policy decision it makes more sense to provide that information to local governments early, or whether it makes more sense to not, in light of some of the substantive concerns brought forward in closing statements.
Commissioner Nanjapa?
If I may, thank you, Director Murphy. That's helpful, and I think also the comment from Chairman Robbins that the local governments could also create some sort of requirement if they so choose. The one thing I'm just wondering, and I do definitely hear your point that it doesn't further our business as a commission, but is there maybe some sort of like just basic courtesy notice that could be given, like we have received a notice of transfer, but without necessarily providing them that whole detailed form? Is that maybe a middle ground option that we would have? And recognizing, I would just defer to you in terms of, again, not trying to create a ton of extra work for all of you, but just trying to think of a way that we can respond to some of the concerns raised. And then, yeah, so that was one point. I had one more, but I'll pause if there was anything else.
Director Murphy?
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Nanjapa, I think it's important to remember that, we're still proposing that the local government gets noticed at the time the transfer is complete. So they're still getting some pretty salient, timely information on which they can then take action. And from our side, kind of trying to administer a pared down notice leaves a lot of work in our camp trying to figure out what can and can't go through. And so we await your direction. But
I appreciate that. And I think, yeah, I think all those different pieces together make sense. I just, wanted to make sure that we talked about it. The other piece that we kind of were getting at the end of our discussion just before the break was, I'm just wondering what I was getting at with asking if we have sort of a way to inventory, the facilities and equipment and everything. Is there any space in the rules currently where we could make that an annual declaration? that the operators would have to provide, just so that we do have a better understanding of what's happening. And so that prior to a transfer, we'd have a better sense of what's there. And I would, look to you, but also Commissioner Gonzalez in terms of, having been through these types of transfers, what's realistic there.
Director Murphy.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Commissioner. As with everything, I have, 4 or 5 different components of an answer, one of which is, as our function and role and oversight as an agency has changed and evolved and grown, our data about facilities is becoming increasingly precise and complete and connected. And so some of the challenges that we have are with pre-existing facilities that existed before there was a way to track them. And so that has created some of the concerns as it relates to transfers. And so again, we have kind of lines in the sand. And so for the most part, I think we are in a space where we're doing a much better job of capturing relationships and what is existing and having a complete data set. I think a lot of that is available. And so I feel less compelled that I think we need a systematic update. But I should also check with Ms. Danzik at least about whether we do or don't need that. My sense is no. The piece that we're really trying to drive home here is getting better information on the front end from operators about transfers, because I think we have a lot of experience with operators who don't bring particularly comprehensive lists and who don't go through our database with the same level of detail that we would like to identify those and tell us where they are going. That to us, it's part of your transaction. And so how do you articulate that to us? And so I think a lot of this is trying to build out what our expectations are given the robust tools that are available through our database itself.
Thank you.
Nanjapa.
Thank you, Director Murphy. That's very helpful. I think that addresses my concerns. Again, just wanting to make sure we talked about them briefly.
Other commissioners on this topic? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to confirm, what topic are we on? Are we on just the whole 218 or are we on a specific subset of it? That's a question.
That's a question. Director Murphy.
Commissioner, I think, and again, I don't get to vote, so it doesn't really matter what I think on some level, but I think that we're talking about what is the list of information that needs to come to the commission as part of a Form 9 pursuant to Rule 218 to flag for staff what we think is going to be transferred and then would be followed up with, and what is the degree of specificity around that list. And this is especially important when we're talking about related facilities and related in air quotes or in subscript, I mean like italicized or something, to flag that it has a really specific meaning to staff in this context and not the broader meaning of the word related. So yes, I think we are on 218 and in a fairly narrow little detailed part of it.
All right, I appreciate that. I'm going to broaden it just to say that, as I evaluate this, I appreciate Commissioner Gonzalez's concerns, and I'm certainly open to conversations. I'm actually comfortable with 218 as staff has drafted it at this point. And if there are further negotiations over the weekend as far as coming up with a more refined language, I'm always open to looking at it. But I don't have any heartburn with the draft as proposed right now.
I would echo that. I, having been director, realized the significance of and the importance of this, getting this right. And I also defer to staff in terms of the work that's gone into it. And I echo Commissioner Messner that if you're able to come back with refinements that you feel are better, I'd be happy to look at that on Monday. Other commissioners would like to weigh in with their perspective? Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to see, I guess it's going to be on an AAG minors list, but I'm curious, what are the specific things that we're going to be coming back to talk to? I want to make sure that But all the things that all the concerns we have are on there.
Director Murphy?
I would just start walking through them to give, because I don't think we've actually brought this down to a list. So the things that are on my list, and Commissioner Gonzalez, I'm going to add the one that you flagged, is the question about related to, and that to me is about Rule 218A1K, 218D1 big B, little 2, little 3. This question of the burden shifting, Commissioner Gonzalez, that you raised in 218D1 big D, little 3. Those two pieces hang together a little bit. And then going back to just my list, the local government notice before transfer. Yep. And then the Form 9, approval comes after the completion of the transfer, and clarifying that in the SBP. Better connecting the process between 209 and 218 for commission review. And then whether to strike the language in 218 D1C around a prior operator attestation. That is an impossible word to say at 4 o'clock on a Friday. So.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director Murphy. I think that captures my list with the exception of one addition. That addition is 218G. In 218G, it basically says that the director can shut in wells or direct wells to be shut in if the operator did not take a Form 9 intent or a Form 9 subsequent and have it approved. One of the things that sometimes happens in business transactions in the oil and gas space is the operations are taken over at the time of closing. And so if an operator takes over at the time of closing, necessarily 7 days after, if they're submitting their Form 9 subsequent at that time, they're going to be in violation for those 7 days. I think it's important to have some buffer there for an operator to be able to operate pending the evaluation of the Form 9 subsequent. And so I had a suggestion for kind of how that might go down, but I will leave that up to you and your conversations with stakeholders to find the right spot there. Let me know if you don't understand or if you have any questions about my concern with that language.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. Director Murphy?
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have unmuted. All I need to say is I think I understand the concern, and we can take a look at it and think through it and at least come forward with language to let you all debate or discuss.
Okay, so is there consensus then that we will put 218 on the shelf and allow some work to be done over the weekend? Number one, and then number two, go to the last item on our list, I believe, which is Rule 507 standing. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before we leave the 200 series, I wonder if I could just ask a question about a different 200 rule.
That would be appropriate. Yes.
Thank you. So, and I didn't initially get this on the list, and I don't. I just thought I would ask the question just to get more information about it. But there was some testimony that indicated in Rule 223 around disclosures and confidential information, whether proprietary engineering and methods should be included in the list. And I guess I just would be curious on staff's thoughts on that.
AAG Minor, Director Murphy.
Sorry, can you run that by me one more time? it kind of got lost in 218 in my enthusiasm for it.
Sure. And I'm gonna preempt this with saying that this is like one of the areas that I'm that's out of my wheelhouse, right? And so I'm just asking questions just to better understand. But there was some comments, particularly from TEP, some testimony indicating that that there was interest in being sure that proprietary engineering and methods and not just chemical disclosures were included in the list in 223. And I noticed that in there's really not any kind of engineering or those types of things included in that list. And so I guess I was just curious as to
Dr. Murphy or
Do you
AAG
mind?
Minor?
Certainly, I think I've had a chance to maybe electronically confer with Ms. Stanzik and Ms. Larson. I think staff is open to that type of information being designated as confidential. Obviously, it would be sort of something for the staff who normally processes that information to run by our engineering experts and make sure if it sort of truly falls in that confidential category. I think it could fall under the sort of catch-all in 12 for other information the operator designates as confidential, or if it's the commission's direction, it could just be added to the list. But staff agrees that that could be a category of confidential information.
Follow-up, Commissioner Messner?
No, I mean, I think it's actually fair that it could fall under 12, and so I'm fine with that. And I don't have a particular suggestion. I was just trying to better understand the concern and see if there was a way to alleviate that concern. And it sounds like 12 is the way to alleviate that concern.
Any other quick questions from commissioners on this topic? Any other questions specific to 200 that didn't make the list? All right, seeing none, AAG Minor, if you could swing us over to Rule 507. Okay, this is 507 contested hearing applications. This is the standing rule. And why don't we pivot down to the edit that was made in the September 18th draft, which I think is 507A2. And again, for purposes of an application filed pursuant to Rule 503G1, surface owners and residents, including owners and tenants of building units located within 2,000 feet of a proposed working pad surface, are affected persons. We did receive a lot of commentary from stakeholders around the auto standing, which is what this does for purposes of a 510 hearing on a waiver to the 2,000-foot siting requirement, that those that are owners or tenants of building units would have an ability to be have standing at the hearing. That is the issue, I believe. I am comfortable with the edit as drafted, as one commissioner putting his thoughts out there for the rest. I think it makes sense. I also think that I think that our new definition of standing would generally include these sorts of parties anyway. I think it gets to one of our goals of transparency, and I think it ensures that we hear from all potentially impacted within 2,000 feet during our hearing. Those are my initial thoughts on this topic. Do other commissioners have thoughts, comments, on this topic? Commissioner Gonzalez and then Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree that if anyone within 2,000 feet had come before us looking to be an aggrieved person, that for the most part that they're in that protection zone that would deserve that kind of standing. There were a couple questions that were raised throughout the closing statements that I'd like one in particular for AAG Davenport to chime in, and then I've got a couple questions for staff, maybe one for Director Murphy and then one for potentially Hearings Officer Larson. So I'm going to take those in turn. I'll kind of throw those out. The first one is this idea of automatic standing not being in compliance with APA. Can we get some sort of opinion on that from AAG Davenport?
AAG Davenport, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez, for the question. Yeah, I'm happy to provide an opinion on that. I want to back up a little bit, though, in providing that and talk about exactly what 507A2 does. Before I do that, though, however, I want to clarify that we're talking about standing to participate in the Commission's hearing process. 503G1 is an OGDP application, and we're talking about automatic standing to participate in that process. We are not talking about standing to bring a judicial review action against the Commission, and I think there may have been some confusion in the pleadings because that provision of the APA was cited. So turning to exactly what 507A2 does is it provides standing, which is just the ability to participate in our process. And without that automatic standing, a person within 2,000 feet would have to make allegations sufficient under 503A3. And all they would have to do to have standing is to make those allegations. Standing in and of itself does not require proof of those things. And so what this proposed rule is doing is saying that a service owner or resident within 2,000 feet does not have to make these allegations to have a standing. And I want to also clarify that this Commission has already recognized that there's substantial evidence in the record that persons living within 2,000 feet may be affected by, for example, noise or light. And that's what the standard is, may be adversely affected or aggrieved. It's stated in 507A. Any person who, even if they have automatic standing, must still demonstrate facts relevant to the application that the Commission could use to make its ultimate determination. Again, standing isn't proof of any of those facts. And providing a person with standing does not guarantee any outcome on any particular permit application. Now there is a provision of the APA 24.105(2)(c) that does provide that any person who may be affected or aggrieved shall be admitted as a party to an agency proceeding. I note that 507A does use that same language, may be adversely affected or aggrieved. I'm not aware of any law that prohibits the Commission from providing additional processes to persons. And in fact, this rulemaking is an excellent example of the Commission providing much more process than is required by the APA. I finally want to note that the Commission retains significant discretion to set its processes, even where it has this automatic standing. And Rule 507 doesn't limit that discretion. I do recommend that the Commission direct staff to include a description of that retained discretion in the statement of basis and purpose for this rule. Hopefully that answers the question and maybe more so. Mr. Chair, you're still on mute.
Sorry. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've got two more questions, but I would like to, at this point, given AAG Davenport's suggestion to offer recommendation to staff for the SBP that we do include some sort of retention of Commission's authority for managing that process. So I'll throw that out. The second question I have, and I'll make this a two-part question to whoever wants to field it can. But what's the process for and I got this a little bit from AAG Davenport, but as I understand the process for exercising the automatic standing under the rule, someone just applies for standing and then it is granted, right, without making any allegations. Is that correct, AAG Davenport, to have that right?
Well, I think, yes, for the most part. And when Mr. Minor is done with his adding his helpful comment, I'd ask him to go back to that. A person who, if this rule went into place as is, the person who, even if they have automatic standing, would still have to assert that they're within 2,000 feet of the working pad surface. Assuming that they did that and that that was valid and true, they would have standing, but they would still need to assert the basis for their protest to that particular application when they filed their petition. So standing is one thing, but asserting the reasons that you want standing and want to participate in the process and whether you support or protest that application also needs to be included.
That's helpful. Thank you, AAG Davenport. And then my last question is, and I think this will be for Hearings Officer Larson, is do the rules provide or do other COGC processes provide for consolidation of these parties just to make it more manageable? There could be potentially a lot of people that might want to have a say, and we want to give as much process as we can to stakeholders, especially within kind of this citing requirements area. And so I just kind of want to make sure that I'm just curious, is there a way through case management orders or is there something in the rules that allows us to consolidate like interests together for this process?
Hearings Officer Larson.
Yes, thank you. So within the rules itself, we don't specifically call out consolidation of parties. However, within the 500 series, we do have the process built in for pre-hearing processes, at which point the hearing officers will seek to identify common issues, seek to identify parties that may in fact be consolidated. And we have done that in the past. And that is something that we do use from time to time in certain matters when there are a wide number of parties who have very similar interests, and for purposes of a smooth adjudicatory process, we would allow for that to occur. And certainly that's something that we could also bring before the commission itself and seek the commission's approval for consolidation of a large number of parties, if that was the most expedient means by which to accomplish that.
Commissioner Gonzalez, did you have follow-up? Thank you.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. Very helpful from everybody. I appreciate the answers. I don't have any follow-up questions. Thank you.
Other questions from commissioners on this topic? All right, I'm not seeing any. Is there a consensus for the statement and basis and purpose language from us? I'm seeing nods heading. And then with that, I'm assuming that we've got sort of a straw vote that yes, we'll just leave this language as drafted by staff and leave that in the rule as well. Okay, seeing nodding of heads there as well. Director Murphy, where are we?
Ready for cocktails, I suspect. But we have a solid, 42 minutes left to be very productive. I think, as I understand it, and Joel will certainly correct me, that we are through the primary issues list that the commissioners raised yesterday, setting aside my own personal delight with Rule 218. And so I think that we've made incredible progress on a number of really thorny pieces. And I infer from that, I'll start this with an I. I infer from that this commission is good with largely the rest of the changes that staff proposed and the rules as they have been proposed. I think that there was some identification that there may be a couple of other pieces to pick up here and there in different rule series, and I don't know if it makes the most sense to work through those particular rule series now, or other questions that may have come up in the last 24 hours for commissioners.
So commissioners, maybe we should just use a period of this last little bit of Friday afternoon for process. We did go into the deliberation with the idea of defining out sort of our big ticket areas that deserved scrutiny. We've gone through that subject to 218 on Monday. I guess first I would ask, does anybody else have sort of a missed big ticket issue that deserves scrutiny that we should identify? And then secondly, we will need to go through each of the series and make sure that we're comfortable with the draft that was published on 9/18. In my mind, what that means is it's more just of a matter of making sure that we're all comfortable with the draft, the clean draft from 9/18. I'm pretty comfortable there. I don't think I've got a whole lot of additional edits that in my mind deserves a vast amount of attention, but I may be on an island in that regard and you all may have other ideas. So those are the two questions that I would present to commissioners. Are there other big ticket items that we have failed to identify that deserve scrutiny? Let's start there. All right, I'm seeing none. And then with that being the case, I for one would suggest we call it a day, because I think we're going to be able to get through this on Monday fairly well, but I also am not sure we're going to be able to get through all the things we need to do in 40 minutes, because not only do we have to do 2 through 6, we potentially need to take up our children's trust petition. We also need to take up the issue around application of rules, and that is the sort of pending permits question. And so then we need to make sure we do it all right by closing the record, and then making sure that we are doing this procedurally in the right manner, that we don't annoy our attorneys, because we're going to need to figure out the conforming edit piece. And then so I guess my point is that in my mind, that's enough stuff that we should reconvene on Monday and take it all up with fresh minds. Commissioner Messner, you had raised your hand as I was mumbling.
No, thank you, Chair. And I agree that with everything that you just said. I think my request was if we could receive sans 218, everything, all the changes that have been made, over today and yesterday, or any changes that have been made, so we do have a clean copy that is, a 925 copy versus a 918 copy to review over the weekend. That would be helpful.
I think if we could get a 925 clean and a 925 red line delivered to our inboxes, that way we'll not be searching for the changes and we can see them. We probably all got them memorized in the back of our heads, but I don't. Commissioner McGowan.
Just wondering if we're all okay if it's a 926 version, given that it's 4:23 on Friday and Director Murphy needs a cocktail.
That makes sense in my mind, and I think everybody else is in agreement.
May I ask
I was just agreeing that Director Murphy needed a cocktail. That was all.
AAG Minor, did you have something to contribute?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. Is the red line you envision a red line of the September 25th and September 18th draft, or is it a sort of red line of the September 25th draft and the August 17th draft?
Whatever you like. I just want to be able to see the edits that we've discussed over the last couple of days, I guess, in my mind. Commissioner Nanjapa, Commissioner Gonzalez, you both raise your hands.
So yeah, and so to Commissioner Messner, I think we might all be on the same page. I'll go ahead and throw it out there, but I think I'd like to see a red line from the September 18th version. So just the last week.
All right, got your direction, Commissioner AG Minor? Any last thoughts for the good of the cause from commissioners or staff? Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you immensely for all of your amazing work and your ability to track all these things. I could see you guys like, you know, real-time texting, and it is incredible. Thank you so much for all your time and effort.
Ditto. All right. Hearings Officer Larson, I do not have my schedule in front of me. Are we set to reconvene Monday at 9 or at some other time?
9 a.m. it is.
Okay. With that, I would look for a motion to adjourn to Monday. What's that date? The 28th?
28th.
Yep. Monday, September 28th at 9 a.m.
So moved.
In a second.
Thank you.
All right. All those in favor signify with a thumbs up. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.